All right, I think we're ready to get back started with the afternoon session, and this is where we really start diving into what we love to talk about is interrupting, really getting into the sort of the advanced weeds of what we're doing, why we're doing it, showing the way that it all comes together as we get later into the question parts. So we're going to be talking about some things on interrupting, spending a little bit of time going through a few slides on that. And then the majority of the afternoon, we're actually going to really get into and dive into. We've got a lot of questions that we can go through and sort of show and illustrate why we're interrupting at certain points and learn things about questions and get into them. And I think that's a huge, huge key.
So like you said, we are going to have a lot of slides with literally like a question on it. And we're going to be breaking it down, talking about, and there's a lot.
A lot.
So we anticipate not getting through all of them. If we don't get through the majority of them, we plan on just doing it, just the two of us later on video, recording that and just providing that after the fact, because we don't want to keep anybody past 4.
We will have a hard stop. And for those watching online, we do have a hard stop at 4:00. So we will stop, make sure everybody gets out of here and that you're at home. Your Saturdays aren't totally consumed.
Right.
But we will also, as Philip said, make sure that we finish out what we're doing with the rest of those questions so that you will have that resource available when the recording is provided.
Just the left switch, not the right switch, please. Perfect. Okay. All right. Can everybody see well? We're good to go? Rolling?
Okay. We'll start. One of the things that I sort of, one of the analogies that I make that I sort of like to use is this concept of a puzzle. The question is this puzzle, right? The question and answer. And so what we're trying to do is use the fewest to identify the puzzle with the fewest amount of pieces we can.
So I like this analogy a lot. You don't need all the pieces to a puzzle to know what it's a picture of, right? Let's say you've got half the pieces, that's Big Ben, right? You can tell. That's the same idea with a question.
Yeah. And so if you don't interrupt, you're basically putting the whole puzzle together before you try to identify it. You don't need to do that. So there are key pieces in the puzzle. We know that from any puzzle you put together, there are key pieces that are going to give you key clues to tell you what that is. So what we're really going to try to talk about is identifying some of those key pieces and being able to use the clues that we have within the question to help us understand what that picture is. And the better we can do that, we can move the interruption point of a question to sooner and still not negatively affect our interruption percentage. We're always shooting for that 70 to 75% in order to be able to win a quiz. So those are the things we're going to talk about here over the next couple of hours. So there are a few things that we highlight here on this first quiz, this first slide, which probably not a surprise to anybody. Keywords. We interrupt in questions at places that help the quizzers locate the verse where the question is taking place. I always, when I'm teaching somebody to interrupt, one of the first things I tell them is the first thing you have to identify when you interrupt a question is, where am I? Where in the material am I? What's going on? You can use a verse reference does that if it's at the beginning of a question, but you can also use context to do that. If there's a particular phrase that's unique to something that's happening in a particular passage of the scripture, then you can get to that place with that phrase. And so one of the first things you have to identify is, where am I? And keywords are a good way to do that. Understanding what those keywords are, key phrases. Most senior question writers, when they write questions, will use the verbiage from the verse most of the time. That's a key. I know where I'm going because I understand the verbiage that I'm looking for is in this specific verse. So we can use those things as clues and context clues to give us the directions of the questions. So keywords can be anything, adjectives, adverbs. Primarily, it's going to be nouns, verbs, prepositions, those things that questions are built around. Generally speaking, questions, multiple questions, especially 2, 3-part, 4-part questions, are built around either verbs or prepositions. So we talked a little bit about grammar before. It's important to understand grammar because it helps you identify patterns and find your way through multiple questions. And we'll dive into all of that stuff later.
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to kind of learn grammar, which Bible quizzing has made me relearn grammar rules.
And again, this is a long game thing, right? You can't expect your brand new 12-year-old quizzer to understand the depths of direct objects and indirect objects and objects of the preposition and all those things.
I don't know any of that stuff.
But as you grow older, you should expect them to start to know those things because they help you. It's just another little piece to the puzzle. And every one of these little pieces adds up in such a way that it gives you that millisecond difference that is the difference. Because when you're quizzing in a trophy level quiz at nationals, you're not interrupting 3 or 4 words away from each other. It's milliseconds. It's a comma. You interrupted before the comma or after the comma. That's the difference. And so every little advantage that you can give yourself makes the difference.
And following along with the puzzle analogy, you have to be able to recognize the pieces.
Yeah.
In order to tell what it's a picture of sooner, right? Like if you don't recognize, oh, this is a piece, you may think, oh, that's nothing. That's not useful at all. Actually, it might be. It might be useful. So that's
one of the things, that's what we want to try to kind of bring out
right.
about when we start going through questions today. So this first slide is just kind of an overall, keywords, what we're looking for. References are pieces to the puzzle, pieces of information that help you understand where the question's going, what the question's going to be, how am I going to answer it, okay? Question words, obviously, that's not a surprise to anybody. And then there are these filler words. These are important. A lot of people overlook these. Mentions, describes, those are trigger words. Those are words where you want to be hitting. Because if something is, if I say, Mark chapter 4, verse 13 mentions, I better hit there.
Trigger words, we should define trigger words.
And we will when we get to those. But that's a good word for us to understand, that understanding what is coming next. And we'll talk about anticipating versus reacting. And there are a couple of different ways that we answer questions depending on the kind of question it is. And it's anticipation versus reaction. Okay.
Interrupting keys. Every kid can be taught to interrupt. I know people are like, oh, it's too hard. I can't do it. Every kid can. Every kid can. It's just a matter of they may need to be taught in a specific way. They may need a little confidence to it, but every kid can. There's no substitute for material command. We've had that, we're gonna hit that again. You have to have command of the material. You can not just quote it, not just kind of know it. You quoted it 6 months ago. Command, control. It's a sword, right? You command a sword, right? You have control of it. You have to have command of it. Teach kids to listen intently. We can't emphasize enough how and this is something that we have had quizzers that don't use their eyes in conjunction with their ears. It's one thing if you hear something, it's another thing if your eyes confirm the sounds that your ears are hearing, right? So
I would even add to that, there are times when you can determine hard or soft consonant or vowel when there's no sound.
With the shape of the
simply by the shape of the mouth and the way it's being formed.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that.
We had a question at nationals this year where it was Avery either knew it was 4,000 or 5,000. And he was one mouth shape away because there's a difference between fa and foot, right? All he got was, so he didn't get the next shape. But that's all he needed, right? And he knew that's all he needed. Sometimes all you need is the next shape of the sound. Okay, but listen intently. Use both your eyes and ears in conjunction. That was something with one of my quizzers this year. It's like, it's one thing if you rely solely on ears. It's another thing if you combine. Anticipation versus reaction. So what is that? There are certain types of questions where you have to anticipate. Quote the verse or study that contains the word. What is that? That is a anticipation. You know where it's coming. It's very well apparent where the hit's going to be. You're anticipating it and you're ready for it. Reaction is
Abba Father. Quote the
Yes.
verse of study that contains this word.
Yeah.
This phrase.
So that's a reaction. That's it is anticipating, but it's a quick reaction where anticipation is more of.
And what I like to say about quotation questions is they are a reaction question that then turn into an anticipation question.
Right.
Because you have to be ready. This is what I always tell our kids. You be ready to go, but don't go. because you got to be ready to react. But then as soon as you recognize that this is not the reaction type, you have to then transition quickly into that anticipation, because the quotation questions are generally one of those two things. Everything really.
Avery always like to say he goes into every quotation question assuming it's not at the beginning, but you have to absolutely be ready. Like you have to be absolutely ready as soon as you hear it's something that's not quote or a single verse, or so, as soon as you recognize that it is the information you need, and that's not really something you can teach. It's something you can practice, but some kids just have that quick twitch recognition stuff, and we just can try and work on it as much as we can.
And the one thing I will say is that you can give yourself, again, little clues. Quiz masters tend to be consistent in the way that they do things. And you can often, like when I was quiz master, my son, who obviously heard me more than anybody else, knew before I ever uttered a sound whether it was going to be at the beginning or at the end, simply because of the way I breathed. I breathed differently, consistently, when I was going to start the verse or start the question with the phrase I needed versus when it was at the end. And he got him every single time, just because he recognized that from hearing it over and over again. And you can pick up on those things as coaches with different quiz masters. That, again, is it going to be that way every single time? No, but we're not going for every single time. We're going for 70 to 75% of the time.
Change of approach based on the question type, point value, direct 30 versus a 6-bar cross reference. On direct 30, it could be right there at the beginning. It could be a very quick hit. It could be at the very end. It could be anything. On a 6-bar cross reference, you're hanging out and you're waiting, right? We're going to let this thing because there's some questions that I don't care how well you know your stuff. You don't have time.
That's exactly
to
right.
finish the question and answer the question. You can answer it in 45 seconds. Good for you. You have 30, so
there are a couple of illustrations where we've pointed that out later too.
Right. Buzz in, then think. This is stuff we teach the kids day one, right? You have to hit, think, answer. It's I wish there was an easier way, but it's the tried and true. I mean, you have to train kids not to be thinking of the answer. You're training kids to be anticipating the right place to hit. You don't care about the answer until it's time to answer it. You have to be thinking about the question.
Yet another reason why material command is paramount.
Right. You can't, if you're sitting there worried, do I know the answer? Do I know the answer? Do I know the answer? You're not hitting where you need to be. You need to know, I know every answer.
There's no way they're asking me a question I don't know the answer.
Yeah, if that's the goal. If you know every answer and you know how to properly answer, because that's another issue that I've seen. It's like, yeah, these quizzes know their stuff, but they're still struggling in properly answering and understanding the question. So they're still hesitant. The younger senior quizzers, especially, is they know their material, but they haven't figured out how to properly. And like maybe they struggle with some pronouns, maybe they struggle with answering in order. We're going to get into some of that stuff too.
Yeah, and I think also what you find is that most of the time, at a high level of interrupting, you're dealing more with your ability to finish the question than you are with your ability to answer it.
Right. I remember there was a tournament where Darren was quiz mastering us. And there comes a point in practice where you know your kids and you know when they know their material that as long as they get the question right, they finish the question right, you know that they know the answer. So you're not even like worried about it. And so Darren was quiz mastering and Avery actually interrupted and finished the question right. And Darren said, that is correct. And just moved on. And Avery never even answered it.
Because you just know, well, I know he got the question. That's the hard. He's going to get it right.
Right. And I find that
which was not the right thing to do, by the way.
Right.
But
which
it happens. So.
But that is the hard there is a point where that's where you want to get to. You want to know that your kids know the answer. The hard part is anticipating the correct place to hit and finishing the answer correctly. You got to get to that point. And they need to be taught to trust in the Lord and in their time studying, like that quizzer confidence we were talking about. The whole hit thing answer, the way you get there is have confidence in your studies and confidence in the Lord that you do this by God's Spirit. Zechariah 4:6. Interrupt for them if necessary. I'm sure everyone has had to do this. Sometimes you have to just hit for or just stop reading, at the point that okay, guys, you don't need me to say verse 7. I already gave you 90% of the puzzle. What's the last 10%? You know, you don't need me to say it. So it's just making them do it. Sometimes that's the only way to do it. Quizzers need to be able to shift gears based on the situation in a quiz. Everybody kind of know that's that patient versus aggressive, you know, like sometimes
we'll talk that out and point that out too as we get into the question parts.
Yeah, for
good
sure.
examples of what the difference is. And we as coaches need to be able to understand that difference and point out that difference.
Well, like
train them, teach them.
One situation would be like when I had confidence in my quizzers that I felt like they were top notch, knew their material, they could get anything. And say we need one of the last 3. Okay. I know they can do it. You can approach it 2 ways. It's like, okay, well, be patient, make sure you don't miss, you know, they've got to be perfect. So let them make a mistake. Or you can say, you need one of the last 3, you go get it. I don't care if you miss the first 2, go get the third one, you know? So it's just, it's that knowing your kids and knowing what's best. It tended to me that I got tired of losing because we were being patient. I was like, I'd rather lose quizzing our game.
A lot of that's personality too.
Yeah,
but
a lot of it is.
I'd rather go down in a blaze of glory or a blaze of something.
You're right.
Glory. Than to sit there and watch somebody else win the quiz.
Right. I'd rather kind of control our own destiny as much as we can, I guess. That's just different people and different kids in different situations.
And also that strategically can change depending on how the quiz is going as well.
There are no questions off. This is hard. This is huge. I had one quizzer, unbelievable quizzer, but if he missed one, he was thinking about what he missed for 2 questions. And it's just like, what are you doing, man? And one thing I said when the kids were younger, every question's a new game. You just need to win enough games to win the battle or whatever. I don't know. You can come up with whatever analogy you want, but every question is a reset. Everyone. And we have to be ready at the beginning of the question. When you question number 3, you're locked in. Whatever it is that triggers it, they are ready. And if they need to develop some sort of habit, I know some kids, you know, look at the board. Some kid, you know, Allie Gentry pushes up her glasses. You know that she pushes up her.
It's like her
she pushes
internal
up her
trigger
glasses and she's ready to go. Like that was, and you know, why you go watch videos of Allie.
Some kids will sit up in their seat. Some kids, well, you see famously the Beardsleys will get up on the table. I mean, it's just sort of their internal mechanism.
They know when I do this, this is me telling my brain I'm in. I'm locked in and focused. And some kids need that and some kids don't. Beginning of the question is key. You have to be locked in the beginning. If you don't hear the beginning of the question, you're toast. Kids must learn how to deal with long deliberations. It's one thing I appreciated about my kids. I pretty much guaranteed, I know I'm talking about Avery a lot because he's right here, but after a long one of those like 10-minute deliberations, I pretty much knew Avery was going to get the next question. He just had the ability to boom, he's right back in. Where some kids, it's like you're waiting, you're tired, it's taking forever. He comes back, maybe it takes you a minute to kind of get back focused again. If kids can develop that ability to just boom, locked in, ready, focus. And what is that? You got to practice that focus. You got to practice that, and just it takes time and experience. But if you make them aware of it, they're more likely to figure that stuff out. All right.
So one first thing that I always try to help people understand is that if you are getting every interrupted question correct, you are not interrupting correctly. You're not going to win, because the whole point is you want to get. You're not trying to. The goal is not to win every quiz by 100 points, right? You want to win the quiz, and the way that you do that is typically the math works out that if you can interrupt at around a 70 to 75% accuracy rate, you will have enough points accumulated at the end of the quiz to be successful, to be the winner. So that's what you're going for when you go into the beginning of a quiz. And lots of smart people have done math. We've seen that play out to be true. And that's just the way it is, generally speaking. Doesn't always work that way, but most of the time.
Well, some people think that it's the number 66% to break even, but it's not. It's not 60%. And I have a real math nerd over here that can really explain it out. But if you just do the basic math, if you get 3 10-pointers right, you have 30 points, right? And then if you miss 2 10-pointers, you lose 10 points and you gave the other team 20 points off rereads, that's 30 points. So that's 60%. You got 3 right, you missed 2, 0 points. You have effectively not hurt or helped your team at all at 60% interrupted correct percentage. And it's good to know that, right? If you're better than 60%, you're helping your team. And if you're less than 60%, you are literally giving the other team more. Not to say you assume that the other team always gets rereads. We just assume it.
And
it's the only way to do it.
The reason that this number is not 60 and 70 to 75 is because that number doesn't account for them beating you to the buzzer and getting some questions correct.
Correct. Right.
Or not getting them correct. But the historical number is if you get 70 to 75% correct, you will win a large portion of your quizzes. That's what you're really targeting in that interruption percentage. So understand that. And people have sort of that same reaction, when you say, if you're getting every interrupted question correct, you're not doing it right, because you could be interrupting sooner.
Right.
You could be getting to more questions that you're not getting to. Okay. Because you're not going for 100% accuracy. You're going for 70 to 75% accuracy. The interesting thing is that this number can change within the scope of a quiz, right? If you get the first 5 questions, that number just changed. Your percentage that you have to get correct from there on out went down, right? If you missed the first 5 questions, it went up. So you have to understand that as a coach. And as your quizzers get to be advanced and older, they begin to understand that. And where that plays out, and you see that working, is then they can begin to make those adjustments on aggressive versus patient. They can begin to see, we're on question 14, and I know for sure that we're down by at least 3 or 4 questions. I'm now at a place where I got to get 90% of these things right. I can't do that sitting here where I'm hitting now. I may have to be a little more aggressive. So that's how that sort of plays into it. It changes, it ebbs and flows with the quiz. Increasing our margin of error, I talked about earlier, one of the reasons that you have to avoid those avoidable mistakes is because they eat into that percentage. If you are interrupting at a rate of 70 to 75%, but 10% of the time you're making what I would call silly mistakes or reference mistakes or material command mistakes, well, now you got to interrupt at 80 to 85% accuracy. What's that doing? It's slowing you down. You're not able to interrupt as far into the left side of that question as you want because you're making so many mistakes. You have to interrupt slower. So you see the logic there? So that's very important to minimize and eliminate those mistakes. Having command of that material. Remembering the goal is 70 to 75% of the time. Move your interruption points to the left. One of the exercises that I love to do that I think is so eye-opening for people is, new coaches or coaches maybe that are just starting to understand the concepts of interrupting. Show them a question. Have them write down, put a slash mark where they think that question should be interrupted. And then go over some of the concepts that we're going to go over and show them where really it could be interrupted. And then it's almost like a light bulb going off sometimes. Oh, yeah, I see why that is. So hopefully we can do some of that today for somebody online or somebody here. But the idea is to move that interruption point to the left. And I think another big key that we don't often talk about, but that is huge, and I think the quizzers in the room will attest to this, even if you interrupt too soon and you're dead, you think you're dead, don't, we see it happen all the time. Quizzers just give up. No, even if you've got almost nothing, you've still got something. And even though your percentages may only go from a 20% chance to a 40% chance, that's a big difference. Right. You could still pull it out. So don't stop, even if you're dead.
Every quizzer should be able to just come up with a decent question with a little bit. Like, even if you there is a 0.05% chance that this is even in the vicinity. It's still there's examples of people just pulling stuff out of their brains, and it be sometimes the Holy Ghost leads you, and you just have
and
to
that's exactly. And I've had situations where I've had a quizzer that hit one. It happened at nationals in the quiz to get to second. The quizzer hit it, and everybody was like, "Oh, it's toast," and he just went immediately to the right place and answered the question correctly. And after the quiz, I was like, "Wow, how did you do that?" He was like, "Well, it's just this, this, and this. It could only be this or this. I mean, this is all it could be." And it was just a matter of being able to take the context clues from the question process them, make a progression, and this much like an NFL quarterback, right? You sort of scan things, you make your progressions, and you take your best shot. What gives you the highest percentage of success?
And if kids have that just give up attitude, oh, I hit too fast, so I'm toast.
I'm done.
Then they're never developing that. Even in practice, you hit too fast. Like, a kid hits too fast, and they're like, oh, I'm sorry. It's like, no,
No.
come on. Give me a question.
What do we got?
Let's go.
Let's
Give me a
talk about
question.
what we have.
Right.
Let's understand what we have so far. What can we get from that?
Right. Just make a decent question. One thing I wanted to talk about with this whole percentage game. So kind of from the other side of this, we're talking about kind of like pushing kids to be more aggressive possibly and understand the percentages. One thing that helps me and I think helps the kids is understanding the swing of missing interrupted questions. So Darren, if you're winning by 85 points and you interrupt and miss question 18 and question 19, how much are you winning by now?
Well, you're not.
You're not. So, because that is a 90-point swing in 2 questions. You're up 85 points.
You went from them having to need all 3 to where you got to get it to win.
Right. So to just understand that 90-point swing in 2 questions in the 30s. 45 points a question if you miss it and the other team gets the reread. That's 45 points. If it's a 10-pointer, it's 15.
It's less less effective on the outcome of the quiz.
It's 15 points, 30 points, 45 points on the different point values.
And one of the things that's, I think, key to understand about that is that helps as a coach. You have to keep that in mind when you're strategizing. When you call a timeout on question 18, you should understand that.
Right.
They need a question, but I can't just be going in and gunning here. So what am I going to tell my quizzers in that situation? Well, I know that one of my quizzers is just dead solid lock on cross references. So I'm going to say, hey, listen, Avery, we'll use Avery as an example because he's sitting in the room. If this is one of your questions, if this is a cross reference question, get it. Let's take it. If it's not, be more patient. And so you sort of strategize your approach to the last few questions based on all these things we've talked about, your knowledge of your quizzer, their strengths and their weaknesses, where you stand in the game from a point standpoint. All of those things sort of culminate in these end of quiz strategic decisions that you make as you go trying to win.
And I will say, the older and the more mature your quizzers are, the more you can give them to think about. The younger and the more inexperienced they are, the less I want them to think about besides the question in front of them.
Yeah, exactly right.
If I don't want my kids knowing, this is just me, I don't want my kids knowing the score.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't want my kids knowing that be more aggressive on this, but if it's this, then do this. But if you hear this, then if he gets to reread,
things.
Just simplify and try and coach them up, before the tournaments to where if they just quiz their game, then you should be successful. And if you need to let them know one thing to think about, one thing to share, that's fine. But the less that they need to think about besides the question in front of them, the better.
And I'll throw this in there. What we talked about earlier, the rule: parents or coaches coach and parents parent. I also think there's the second part of that rule: coaches coach and quizzers quiz. Don't let your quizzers be up there trying to calculate what the score is, how many more I have to get right, all those kind of things, because it's just clutter. It just gets in the way. They need to be thinking about what they need to be thinking about. Those are the things that we need to be thinking
and
about.
In order for them to do that, they need to know and trust that we are taking care of the things that we need to think about.
Well, you said something that's key, and I agree with you that a lot of people don't, I think, maybe fully understand our position, and as the kids don't necessarily need to know the score. I'll tell them, we need a couple. We're 1 down, we're 2 down, just a general sense. I don't want them sitting up there trying to do math when they've got a 6-part cross-reference question coming up that they got to try to answer, right? I want them to be able to focus on what they need to do. So I think that was a good point that you brought that out.
Yeah, usually my strategy is just, if you need to know the score, I'll tell you the score. If you don't need to know the score, then just, and I don't tell you, you don't need to know. You just need to worry about the next question.
And it's a trust relationship.
Right.
So a couple other things from the quizzing interruption standpoint is observation is huge. This is a big, big thing for us as coaches that we can help our quizzers. One of the biggest ways I think we can help our quizzers be successful is interrupting is making these observations, specifically with regard to quiz masters and question writers. Quiz masters, how do they speak? Do they talk fast? Are they slow? We talked about focus earlier. One of the things that we learned early on in intermediate quizzing was that Brother Nathan Reaver, who we love dearly, by the way, had zero time between the end of one question and the beginning of the next question. Zero. I mean, that is correct. Question number 20 is worth, that was it. You were gone. And if you were a kind of quizzer that needed that 2 or 3 seconds of downtime to reset, you were in trouble. And so we understood that. We noticed that. That became a pattern. And so when we got our quizzers, that's what we told them. Hey, you can't do that. You got to be ready. You got to be ready. Onto that focus.
And how can you work on that? You can have a quiz in practice and say, hey, I'm going to read this quiz as much like this quiz master as I can. He likes to go fast. He likes to read fast. I'm going to try as a coach to read that way in practice. Okay, now I'm going to try to read slower. Like kids have to be able to adjust. And if you just read like you all the time, they may be really good at quizzing when you're the quiz master. But if you're not the quiz master, then that may be giving them a disadvantage.
And one of the places where I feel like there's some low-hanging fruit on that, as we indicated here, is quotation completion questions, because quotation completion questions, you can get it every time or get burned by hitting it in the exact same place, depending on who the quizmaster is. Because some quizmasters will say quotation completion question, in the beginning was the word. And some quizmasters will say quotation completion question, in the beginning was the word. And knowing the difference is going to get you that question or give you an illegal response, knowing the difference between how they read. So those type observations are key for us as coaches to help our quizzers understand, to allow them to then put them into application and execute them in a quiz. So we'll move on talking about that. The other thing that we've really talked about a lot already, and we will do so as we go through the rest of this day, is understanding. We have to comprehend what we're talking about. It is crucial at a senior level. We've got to know what the material means, not just what it says. What's going on? What's the context? What's the scenario? I sort of equate it to when I was a kid. You guys probably didn't do this. You were too young, but we used to have to give book reports, right? You'd have to stand up in front of the class and tell who's the antagonist, who's the protagonist, what's the setting, all of these, what's the plot, all of these kind of things. We need to understand those same macro type things about the verses that we're studying, because it establishes the context, which helps us develop and understand the content.
And I want to commend Brother Larabelle. I've heard that you like to memorize material with your quizzers. Is that correct? Every year he memorizes all of the material with the quizzers, which good for you.
Amen to that.
That is fantastic.
Well, now that I feel terrible, let's move on.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now, have you found benefit from doing that as a coach?
Yeah.
For contests,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Correct. So he said, yeah, he's saying, sorry, they can't hear you. He's saying that, from a contest perspective, knowing the material, the quizzer may maybe feel that something's wrong, but not for sure. But as someone that knows the material, you can, especially on like listening to the other team answer, you can find little things that.
Well, and probably from competitive standpoint, probably that's not as much of an advantage as it used to be, because used to all you had was the hand material and you had to look through and try to find things where they were. But with the onset of all of the, lookup functions and all those kind of things, you can pretty much get to something real quick. But what it does do, I think, and it kind of goes to the first bullet on this slide, is that helps us be able to take that information and sort of big picture apply it to not only our lives, but to the kids, right? Excuse me. It's important for us to understand and comprehend the material for a lot of reasons, but the primary one is because of what we've talked about so many times. What are we doing here? This is a ministry. We're trying to develop and disciple young people. And if we can't help them understand what the Word of God says, what the writer of Hebrews says, is the meat of the word, then we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, in my opinion, as coaches in this ministry. So why you're laughing at me? I was
I'm
being all
laughing at
serious.
my-
I had a good
I'm laughing at
moment
my
there, and you're
daughter.
laughing at me.
She was lip
All right,
syncing,
whatever.
lip singing the song. She's
Another reason why we understand these things, obviously we've talked about, is the questions are written to test context comprehension, not just verse knowledge. We talked about that when we talked about junior versus senior. And if you haven't noticed that, I challenge you this year, pay attention to that. You will notice that. You will notice that questions, everything from bounding the question answers by verse versus punctuation, all those kind of things play into that.
And sometimes a question is written not in verse order to test comprehension, right? Sometimes the why is at the end of the verse, but maybe it's the first question word, and that's written in a way. And sometimes it's just better flow for the question of writing, but sometimes it's written that way to test, to make sure that the quizzer knows. And that's why the next thing, pronouns.
Yeah, and before we jump to pronouns,
Okay.
we'll talk just a second about, and I think we hit it later, but why do we have to answer in order? You'll talk about this.
Right.
Well, why is it answer in order the question or not? Sometimes it's out of order from the verse, because if you just quote the verse, you may or may not know what's actually going on in that verse. But if they mix it up a little bit and you have to think about who is the who, what is the what, and why is the why, and
Or what is
which
the
ones
why.
of those things go together, right? Then you prove that you understand the context and the content. And another one, as he said, is pronouns. Big part of senior Bible quizzing is pronouns. One of the main things, we have a whole slide for that people struggle with when they come to senior Bible quizzing versus junior Bible quizzing. But the reason for it is because, again, it proves that you understand who is involved, what's happening, who is saying what to who. And it's important to know that, not just that these words are being spoken by someone to someone else, but who said it and who did they say it to? Why is that important?
Yeah, like Mark 1:10, we have a big debate on, and he looked up, it was when he was baptized, he looked up and he saw a dove descending. Who's he? Was it John or was it Jesus? Right. And that there's still a lot of debate about it, but it's important for us to seek that stuff out. Who saw the dove? Was it, and to see, and sometimes I have to just text someone smarter than me, and we have to talk it out. And some of the things are in the POI as to who those pronouns are referring to.
I was going to say, that's part of what the POI does, is it helps for Bible quizzing purposes, whether we agree in broad scope or not, but for Bible quizzing purposes, the decisions are made. This is what it's going to be. Whys and hows, obviously, we've got to know why and how. Those are two, what I call higher level questions that we tend to hear a lot at districts and nationals, because again, they test our knowledge of content. And then contesting, very key for us to understand the material in order to test effectively. Pardon me just a minute. So next slide, some things to look out for as we go forward into this interruption discussion. Grammar, we talked about it earlier. Know your grammar. I know that's like, what? We're talking about Bible quizzing. Why do we got to know English? Wow, I'm not diagramming a sentence here. Well, in ways, if you can, it will be very helpful for you. It's a piece. It's a piece to the puzzle that you can use to help you see what that picture is. Know what is a proper noun. It's important to know the difference between a noun and a proper noun. Anytime you hear a question that says names, you're looking for a proper noun.
Capital.
It's a capital letter. That's a huge key. We'll point some of that out later. Verbs. What's a verb? What's the difference between an action verb and a static verb? I call it. There's a proper English term that I can't remember off the top of my head. What's the difference between them? Why does it make a difference? Understand those things. Prepositions. If you know your prepositions, you can pretty much determine on many multiple type questions where your questions are going to be, simply because you know that most of the time they're going to be built around the prepositions. So if you can identify the prepositions, you know where to build your questions around. Know your grammar. Adverbs, all objects of a bunch of things that we didn't put in here, but know your grammar. Another big key is punctuation. We've talked about this already. I'm going to spend a lot of time on it, but it is so important. Punctuation is more often used to parameter questions and answers in senior quizzing than is verse reference. And so many people struggle with that idea because it's just coming from that sort of that junior mindset, right? Everything is about what verse, what verse, what verse, what verse. In seniors, it is not, because that doesn't show me that you understand that what happened 3 verses ago is tied to this verse in this way, and it means something. It's important to know that. So punctuation over verse reference. And then we talk about these trigger words, and I'm gonna let Brother Philip take.
Oh, okay. So trigger words, it's not as scary as it sounds. It's basically words that, okay, say you interrupt, a quizzer interrupts a question and they're trying to figure out a multiple part or a direct or whatever, and they're searching through the verse trying to figure out where the question word's going to be. Trigger words are words that say, oh, that is a why, that's a how, that's a possibility, that whatever. Okay, so anytime they're in the verse, not anytime, most of, well, for because, any because in a verse is a why. You know, I walk down the street because I want to get exercise. What's the why? Because I want to get exercise, right? Anytime, because, that's a true why trigger word. For, lest, that, therefore, all those are trigger words for whys. Not always when it comes to for and that, but you know, that ye may be saved, or I'm trying to think of the verse right now. Lest ye be cast into the lake of fire. All those are whys, and when quizzers see that in the verse, they should be like, oh, that's a why. That's a why. That it just helps trigger them to see that. Hows. Most prepositions and adverbs are how. What's a preposition? With, by, in. Okay, it's a word that I'm trying to think of the definition of a preposition. It's a word that speaks to the relationship of like a noun
It's a binding word.
It's a
Really.
binding word.
Yeah.
Okay. So like with fervor, with triumph, with whatever. Those are hows, right? How did you run down the street? With grace. Not me, but maybe you. With grace. That's a how. How did you run down the street? Quickly. That ly words, it's an adverb, right? That's a how. Kids need to see that. Kids need to know, oh, that's a how. That's a how. And if they see that, they'll be able to anticipate and make better questions. Possibilities in the verses. If you see a may, a might, or an if, that could be a possibility. So a lot of times question writers write, Proverbs chapter 1 verse 27 speaks of the possibility, which for aggressive quizzers, that's usually where they hit, speaks of they're hitting and they get possibility. And then you're like, oh, I got nothing. Actually, you have a lot. You have a lot because you know that the question is going to be circled around the possibility in the question. So it's going to have something to do with that might, may, if word in the question. It actually has to make sense. That's the thing about, another thing about juniors to senior questions is while junior questions can basically be fragments or not complete thoughts, senior questions actually have to make sense. They actually have to be a real question that you could ask to someone else. And I'm not trying to bash on junior questions at all. They have their place, obviously. But junior questions have to be grammatically sound, real questions. And we just need to know that. And then the last one, the under what condition, that's an if. If you say, you know, if a quizzer hits on a question and they get under what condition, they should be looking for an if. If they interrupt before they hear under what condition and they see that there's an if there, well, okay, that's a good question. And we're going to talk a lot about those. Like there's certain things that question writers like to do. Oh, that's an under what condition. Oh, that's a possibility. Oh, that's a why. And there's certain things that's a when, you know, like distinct things that the question writers tend to, and when they need to notice those things and make those types of questions. All right.
Yeah. And you might wonder why this matters. What does it matter? It's a piece. That's all it is. It's a piece to the puzzle. It helps you give you that, maybe that one little extra thing that you need to see that picture at the point at which you interrupted that question.
Identify the flow or pattern of the question. If you hear how many, what's the rest of the question going to be, Nathan? How many and what are they? It's probably, if it's a two-part question.
That's correct. You couldn't hear him. He got that right.
Yeah. Yeah, how
Yeah.
many verses? But you need to, based on the question type, you need to know what how many means. That tells you a lot. You need to know in the different situations when is that. How is Paul most likely is going to be described? How is this person described? It's not, how is Paul? That's got to be a described most likely. How did Paul? That's different, right? But we need to notice those things.
Well,
Every
okay, and
little
even
piece.
how did Paul versus how does Paul?
Yeah, did versus
All
does.
of these things are clues that can get you. What's the first question again? What's the first thing you got to find when you hit a question? Where am I?
Right.
What's going on? You can use these context clues to get you to where you're supposed to be. And from there, make your questions.
One common pattern in the same verse that says this, it also says this, and then typically it ends with, and what is this verse? Like almost every time. If you notice that, how do we notice that? I get a question set and do a control find and in the same verse and just see every time that is used, it typically flows this way. So when you notice similarities in these questions, there's only so many types of questions. There's only so many ways to write a question. So if you can notice these patterns and these things, and question writers do try to be consistent. So we have to take advantage of their consistency. Concerning John, this isn't always the case, but a lot of times when it's concerning X, what is recorded in this verse, or in this verse, what is recorded? That's
especially if it's a direct question.
Especially if it's a direct
And
question.
especially if it's a direct 30-point question,
Right.
because you're going to probably have 2 or 3 verses that describe some unique aspect of John somewhere in your material. And if you're astute and you know these clues, you can interrupt that question way earlier than another person might think you could.
So these are little things where if quizzers hit, they need to know what they have. They need to know what puzzle pieces they have. If they have more, they could have a lot more than they think. Emphasize words. We're going to hit a lot on this.
Yeah. And before we jump there, let me throw one more in here that I think we probably could have put on this slide. And that is referring to.
Oh, can't believe it. We're going to have questions later.
We'll show that. But anytime, Avery, if I say the words referring to the woman with an issue of blood, one of the things that quizzers tend to do when they hear a description is in their mind, they jump to the verse that describes that person.
Or that has that phrase in it.
That has that phrase in it. And they start to look for questions in that verse. Well, with you start the question with referring to blah, 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 really probably your first shot should be going to find a pronoun that's not in that same verse that's talking about that person. Because that's what that word referring does. That's a trigger word that tells you, okay, probably this is not the verse that has that phrase, but it's a verse that has a pronoun referring back to that person.
Yeah, whenever you see that referring to, you look for you want your question to contain a pronoun that is referring to, that is that antecedent.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Emphasize words. I'm gonna. So the first, I wish they could hear the whole room because we could really kind of bounce around here. But Jesus spake what? Okay, let's say that all these are 2-part questions. Okay, if it's Jesus spake what, what's the next half going to be? And someone else spake what? That's the pattern. The emphasis tells you what's going to change in the pattern. Okay, so Jesus spake what, and John spake what? Okay. Jesus spake what? What's going to say the same? Most likely. Jesus, right? Jesus isn't emphasized. The verb is emphasized. This is going to probably be a verb pattern. Jesus spake what and kicked what? I'm just
You're all about Jesus kicking stuff today.
No, Jesus spake what and what'd you say? And saw what? That's a good one. Spake what and saw what? Jesus spake by what? What is by?
Preposition.
The preposition. So this is going to be most likely a preposition pattern. We need to find another preposition. Jesus spake by what?
Through
on
what?
Through what? On what? With what?
In what?
Yeah. And you don't want to say, you never want to say Jesus spake by what? Where? Because that's the first one has the preposition in the question, and the second one has the preposition in the answer.
And this next one, the last bullet, is the way you should say that question.
Jesus spake by what. So what's going to change?
The question word.
The question word. It's Jesus spake by what and went where, or
when, or
yeah,
whatever the verse calls for.
So the emphasized word shows you in the pattern what's going to change and what's going to stay the same. This is not completely consistent, okay? Because you can't emphasize everything that's changing, right? Especially like in a cross-reference question. You don't want 3 emphasized words in the first half of a question, right? But question writers try to emphasize something, the thing that is most and the most important thing, to let a quizzer know what is changing on the other side of this pattern.
And question writers and good quiz masters do a really good job of that.
And it's I can't tell you how important this is. I remember at BQE there was a really good team, a really good coach, and there was a cross-reference question, and it was clear. She got the emphasis. She got the emphasis. She got everything that she needed, and she went another direction. Like she didn't go with the emphasis. And I was talking to the coach afterwards. I'm like, hey, that was a good quiz. He's like, yeah, it was 50-50. And I'm like, no, it wasn't 50-50.
It was 98.
Yeah. You think it's 50-50 because you didn't
know what you had. You didn't see the puzzle.
You didn't see all the pieces of the puzzle. So it's so important that we show our kids this stuff, and not to say you can show it to them and they can still not hear the emphasis and still just ignore it or whatever, but that,
guess what we'll be talking about after the quiz.
Right. This is what we talk. Hey, did you hear that Jesus spake by what? And sometimes you don't get the emphasis. Sometimes you hit right before the emphasis and you can tell that the quiz master is about to emphasize the next word.
Or what's going to be emphasized based on what hasn't yet been emphasized.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brother Frost.
Question real quick.
Well, that's why I said good. On the paper, it
okay, real quick, we need to repeat the question. So the question was, are quiz masters trained to read properly when it comes to emphasis?
Yeah. Now, the word trained is probably not the right word, but good quiz masters do that, and they know that. That's not to say they don't make mistakes. But, I mean, it does happen where you get a quiz master that either may not understand the importance of emphasizing it correctly or just may mess it up, and it may throw your quizzer off. You know what that is? That's an unavoidable mistake.
Or you can have a question writer like me that didn't emphasize the question as well as it should have been emphasized. And a good quack master, a good quiz master can see that and make an adjustment, right? Because that's what a good quiz master should do, is to, it's okay to adjust your emphasis on words based on. And another thing, good quizzers, as a quiz master, that Darren will tell you, he can make a quizzer hit based on how he reads a question.
We'll talk about that later.
It's very important for our quiz masters to read correctly, and we do our best. But
there's such a thing as dictation and tone that are also big clues on when you can interrupt questions. And if, as a quiz master, I don't understand that, or I don't make a concerted effort to do that properly, I can throw off an advanced level quizzer. So that's incumbent upon me as a quiz master to make sure that I do that well. But again, what I say is those are those things that fall into that margin of error that mean we have to eliminate all of those other avoidable mistakes, because you can't do anything about that. It is what it is. And but you can do something about the other 2 questions where you just misreferenced, or you forgot how many parts it was, or whatever.
This goes back to that unavoidable versus avoidable, right? Yeah. If we take care of all of the things we can avoid, we have to live with the unavoidable, right? And it's just part of the game. Avery. One second, everyone. So Right.
So what Avery's saying there is, and if you can't hear him, is that there are quiz masters that take that into consideration in their ruling, whether or not they felt like they emphasized it correctly or incorrectly, because it definitely can throw off a high level quizzer. Now that's great, and you can get contests granted on that sometimes, and that's one of those contests that the quizzer should take down, right? Because it's way more effective for the quizzer to say, "Hey, man, the way that question was read, it threw me off," than for me to say, "You know what? I think that may have messed up my quizzer." That's totally different. Totally different, from sitting at the judges table. That means totally different things. But what I'll also say is you can't count on that. It's not a rule. There's nothing that says they have to. You can try, but it's just going to depend on the quiz master.
Right. Okay. Okay. One question online. Let's go ahead and take the question.
We have one question from online. We'll take that question now. Yeah,
Sure. Questions for ideas. High command material quizzer. And they know about the 70% accuracy rate. But they want all the pieces of the puzzle before they do it.
So to finish that question is they do it well in practice, but in a quiz environment with the pressure on, they tend not to be able to do it as effectively. This is a confidence problem right here. So we have to figure out how we get that quizzer confidence to be able to do that.
Goes back to those things. You told them to trust in the Lord. I mean, we can't make our kids do anything. We can only do so much, but it's going back to that trust in the Lord. Zechariah 4:6 is huge, talking about that stuff. Trusting your teammates, trusting your studies. There's a lot of life lessons to be learned.
And I agree with all that 100%. But I will say that I think from a practical standpoint, one of the things that I would try and have tried before, and I think I might have mentioned this early, is help them understand that missing a question is not failure. What's the definition of success that you have for that quizzer for that tournament? Maybe it's, I don't care if you get it right or not. I don't care if you error out. Hit the buzzer 3 times and try.
But it's one thing for that to be your definition, but you have to change
their
definition.
Yeah, they have to be on the same page.
Right.
Yeah.
The quizzer has to change their definition of success.
Right. And just help them understand what is, it's not necessarily failure because you're having a thing with this. And it's just like everything else. You have to do it and experience it over and over and over again until you're able to process in that environment to do it.
Absolutely. Okay.
We have 2 or 3 more slides and then we'll take a break.
Okay. Proper answering. I do this a lot. Develop good habits. What are good habits? Good habits are habits that our quizzers can get that can save them in a pinch. Okay. If you do this all the time, 90% of the time it's not necessary, but if you do it all the time, it'll save you 10% of the time. 10% of the time, if you don't do this, you're going to miss it. But if you do this every time and you develop this good habit when it comes to finishing questions and answering, you'll get it right. Essence. Want to define essence real quick. An answer to a non-quotation type question is correct, which real quick, the only thing that has to be quoted in senior Bible quizzing are quotation questions. That is it. That's the only type of question that has to be quoted.
That requires being quoted.
Yes. An answer to a non-quotation type question is correct when it contains the essence of the information asked for. Essence is defined as not only the basic or crucial element or feature of something, but also the intrinsic properties that serve to characterize or identify it. Darren, can you simplify that for us?
This to me is like reading the end of Romans 7 when I read this. The good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. It's blah, blah, blah. So when I read that, I'm so confused. Here's what essence is to me. It's the thing that makes something what it is. It's that simple. That's what essence is.
Essence is the thing that makes something what it is. So, for instance, it doesn't matter if you say, I'm trying to think of a good example. It just
Jesus spoke to the multitude. Jesus said to the multitude.
Right. Essence.
Essence.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Jesus was walking by the sea on the land. Jesus was walking by the land on the sea. Like in essence, same thing. You're not quoting it, but
Actually,
in the
those are
essence,
two totally different things. If you're walking on the sea versus on the, but whatever.
Okay, the quizzer must not only give the correct answer, but the quizzer has to ask the correct question.
And this
Okay.
is the part we talked about where most of the time with senior quizzers, early advanced interruption, this is the struggle. This is the part that's difficult.
Is getting the right question versus answering. And we need to get to the point with our kids where they can answer questions. And that's the first step. If your kids need to be able to understand how to properly answer questions, which is why we're kind of talking through this. The only answers that need to be quoted, label quotation questions, and narrow it down. We talked about, want to talk about this. This is good habits, right? Narrow your questions down. Not everything needs to be narrowed down, but there's something really important we need to talk about. And that's when it comes to pronouns. We'll talk about this. If the question on the paper that is being read is open to the chapter and the question that the quizzer makes is narrowed down to a verse, they're still expected to treat their answer like it's open to the chapter when it comes to pronouns and such.
And we will dive into that.
We're
in
gonna
just
dive into
a
that.
couple slides.
But good habit, narrow it down. Put a verse reference on it. Is it necessary all the time? No. But are you going to miss one every once in a while if you don't? Yes. Is it a good habit to just do it all the time? Just get in the habit of doing it as a quizzer? Yes, because sometimes it's going to save you. And those are the good habits that we want to develop. And quizzers need to use their time. I get so aggravated sometimes whenever a quizzer answers a question and sits there for 20 seconds. And the quiz masters, even if they're not even looking at them, you have 30 seconds. Obviously, you don't want to use that time and make yourself incorrect by saying something, but there's nothing wrong. You should answer the question. And then if they don't say it correct, quote the verse. They still don't say it's correct. Figure out are you answering out of order? Maybe, okay. The how is with grace. The why is because Jesus kicked the table. Okay, I'm going to get off of that. Use your time. Use your time. Don't just sit there. Use your time. All right. Go ahead.
Man.
I'm going to, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about answering and techniques and then answering in order, and then we'll take a break. Is that good before pronouns?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
a good place to stop.
So answering techniques, these are things that I think that are important for us to practice because they can affect the way that our answers are heard or understood. Because the bottom line is, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what is heard. And that is not semantics, that is different.
That is so true.
Okay, so you have to know that. So you can argue all day long that you thought you said something, but if it didn't show up on the tape that way, you're still wrong.
I think of an example where one of our quizzers at nationals, she knows she said the right thing, but she started saying it with her mouth over here. And then she came into the mic as she, like on the first two words, she kind of came into the mic. I know she said it right, but we did not hear it right. So it's little habits like that is just making sure it's clear.
And so as coaches in practices, we need to be listening for and watching for those things. And we have a few examples of things that I've seen and Brother Philip has seen over the years, listening for those bad trends. And one of them that I see that a lot of kids do is where they breathe. They get themselves in a situation like, especially when you're quoting a verse, and Avery, you can probably relate to this, where you get yourself quoting and you're not anywhere near a natural stopping point. And so you try to take a breath almost as you're quoting, and you end up not getting enough volume on a sound for it to be heard. And so somebody contests and you go back and listen to it and you know you said it, but it's not there simply because you're not breathing well as you're answering the questions. And they might seem like, wow, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a big difference when it's the last question and you got to have it to go to nationals. And these are just those little things that you can do to help yourself. So how are you breathing while you're speaking? Make sure that you're breathing and stopping in the right places. Make sure that you're taking enough breath if you have to speed quote to get all the way through the thing. Okay, those kind of things. Another one is we've all heard of young people that are just so soft-spoken. You just cannot, you can't hear them. They could quote it right every time, but if you can't hear them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, you're really soft-spoken.
Yeah, I know. I have that problem. But you have to work with them on things like that because it doesn't matter, again, what you say. It matters what is heard. And another thing that I think is key is enunciating certain words and specifically sound combinations. And one of the big ones is a word that ends with S and the next word starts with S. Jesus said. Okay. If you say Jesus said, especially when that's a plural, that first word, it's hard to know whether or not you said it as a plural or whether or not you were just saying the next word. And so make sure that in those situations, your quizzers know, stop, pause. Make sure there's a discernible difference between those two things. Just answering techniques that can help you. And another big one for me is this, and Philip touched on this a little bit earlier. Take away subjectivity from your answers. I harp on this with quizzers all the time. Subjectivity. Subjectivity, of course, is the ability for someone to have an opinion about it. I don't want the quiz master to have the ability to have an opinion about whether or not my question was correct or not. It's correct, or my answer. It's correct because I said it exactly the way I should have, and there's no opportunity for them to say, well, what about this or what about that? So anytime I see an example where I have a chance to point out to a quizzer, you left that open for interpretation. Don't do that. Remove all subjectivity from that response. It's a huge thing. And then we talked about understanding the signs for quiz masters. If they're still looking at you, watching their mouth, all those things, develop those good habits during practices will help you during quizzes.
Yeah, I had to make my quizzer, and fantastic quizzer. I had to make her after every question. I said, "Did you look at my mouth? Were you watching my mouth?" Every question, like develop the habit. Because if you quiz for years, you don't have that habit. It's hard to break it. But develop good habits. One thing that we're talking about the not enunciating. You when you're working with your kids and you hear something, you need to be like, "Oh, that's a trouble spot." You had and say, "Hey, on this verse quotation, slow down right here." Disciples' sake. That's something that he said, for the disciples' sake. Guess what? Like, you're not going to be able to speed quote through that one. You need to know this is a trouble spot. I can speed quote it in a question up to this point, and then you need to stop, say it clearly, and then move on. You have to know the trouble spots, especially different kids speak differently, different things. So you just have to be aware. Answering in order. This is huge. This is a good habit that we need to develop. And this is something that has to be developed in practice. You have to get used to this. So this is from the rule book. This is an example. Two-part question. By whom did grace and truth come, and by whom was the law given? Jesus Christ, Moses. That is correct because they answered it in order. The law was given by Moses. Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. That is not in order, but what is it? It clarifies itself. You're answering the second one clearly. Whom was the law given? The law was given by Moses. The second answer, but it's clear. Is there any subjectivity with that? There's not. It's clear, even though it's out of order. Correct answer. You quote the verse. Quoting the verse would be correct because the quote identified the correct answers with the corresponding question parts.
By the way, this blurb is straight out of the manual.
Yeah, the straight out of
the rules manual.
Incorrect answer. Moses, Jesus Christ. Why is that wrong? It's reverse order, and you didn't clarify what's what. Even if you say Moses, Jesus Christ, you can't even go back and fix that because you can't, right? I don't think you can.
Well, you've already said the incorrect thing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and that would be allowing for subjectivity.
Right. Incorrect. The law was given by Moses, Jesus Christ. So second part was not clearly and properly identified. Nothing is identified by default. That is big. Just because you clarify part of it doesn't mean the rest of it is clarified.
And why is that? Just because you proved you knew one half of it doesn't mean you proved you knew both of those things.
Yes.
Context and content.
Avery's saying that quizzers can fix.
Quizzers can try to fix it, but it becomes the opinion of the quizmaster whether they fixed it or not.
So say you give Moses the first answer. Moses. Right. Right. He's saying, if you say Moses first, you can correct by saying is the one that gave the law and grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Yeah. You just have to clarify and make sure it's good. Make sure the officials don't have to pick out your answers. Okay. This is especially crucial, in my opinion, when it comes to hows and whys. And let me explain why. A how is not self-clarifying, and this is not in the rule book. This is my opinion, what I have learned. When it becomes crucial to answer in order is when it comes to hows and whys and whens, because most of the time those do not clarify itself. If I say, by whom did grace and truth come and by whom was the law given, that there are words around the question word that makes it self-clarifying if you just quote it, right? But if you say grace and truth came by Jesus Christ because blah, 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 that word because does not clarify that this is my answer to the why. Okay. If I say, Jesus said what, and Moses said what, and I say Moses said X and Jesus said X, that's self-clarifying, right? I'm clarifying. Moses said this, Jesus said this, even if it's out of order. But you can't do that with whys and hows and sometimes whens. Sometimes the word when is in the when, when they were walking by the sea, which that's, in my opinion, self-clarifying. But there's no lead-in words with whys and hows, which in my opinion, when there's a why or a how or a when in a multiple part question and they answer it out of order, I just count them wrong in practice. Just count them wrong. And honestly, in practice, what you can do, even if they would be right, in practice, you say you're wrong. You answered out of order.
Yeah,
even though
it goes to developing good habits.
It goes to developing good habits. Even though, yeah, you would be right at a tournament,
Maybe.
I'm going to count you wrong because I want you to get in the habit of answering in question order. So, all right, clear as mud.
Yeah. Any
Everyone?
questions?
Any questions over here?
We'll take a break after this, and then
All right.
we'll
We're gonna
study
come
in for the
back
long
at-
haul. Any questions online? Did you say? No.
We're going to come back at 2:05, 8 minutes.
And be ready to dig in because
All
we're going to
right.
start going. We're going to go all out after that.
Yeah,
Yep.
pronouns and then question breakdown. Well, question.
There's
writers.
pronouns. Think
Okay,
like a
yeah.
question writer, and then question break.
Yep. This is our next slide. We can go ahead and put that up there.
Yep. Hey, we haven't even got to the lot of material yet.
And we're back.
All right, we're back, everybody, and we're going to talk just quickly about a couple more slides before we get into really diving into the questions. And the first one of those is the pronoun rule. This is huge, hugest of the huge is this pronoun rule when it comes to senior quizzing. This is taken right out of the manual, the majority of it. Learn it, know it, understand it. Rule D17 of the rule book. If a question references a single verse, multiple verses, or a chapter, in other words, whatever parameters are established by the question, and any pronoun that is essential, and that's a key word, essential to a correct and complete answer within the respective scope of the question. So in other words, if you got a pronoun that is essential to the answer that is contained within the parameters established by the question, you have to identify that pronoun as part of your answer.
I think it's really important to understand what the scope of the question is.
It is the parameters established by the verse reference, or if it's, and we'll talk about it later, if there's not a reference on there, it defaults to the chapter level.
You never have to specify a pronoun that is not identified in that chapter ever. If it's identified in another chapter. Okay, for instance, I think there was one year where we had a study and Jesus wasn't actually named in like chapter 4. There's a lot of he's
doctrine,
like,
I think.
There's doctrine. Yeah, a lot in doctrine.
Yeah.
If it's not in the chapter, not the book, if it's specified in another chapter, then you don't have to specify it if it's not in that specific chapter, even if the question is open to the whole study.
The chapter is the default, and that is the next bullet point. If a question doesn't reference a verse at all, only pronouns that are specified in the verse's chapter need to be specified. So again, if it's the last verse of the previous chapter, it says who it is, but it doesn't in that chapter, doesn't matter. You don't have to do it. Only if it's in that chapter. That's the default.
But
only if it's, and that's only if the clarification in that chapter is
correct.
Correct.
And it's only yes.
Yes.
And it's only
And the
if,
comment was that's only if it's in your verses of study. So in other words, we have portions of chapters this year specifically. And if that pronoun is identified in a portion of chapter that's not included in the study, it's not considered to be in the chapter.
yes. Sorry, Nathan had a question. Do you want to come up here and ask the question? Oh, how do the points of interpretation go with the scope? I don't follow your question. If the points of interpretation has a pronoun and it says that pronoun is
Right.
Jesus,
Does it supersede?
does that
the-
count? No,
yeah,
it does
no,
not.
It does
So
not
the
supersede.
POI does not change the pronoun rules in
Yeah.
any way. So
It
the
is, and I haven't seen that case, but if that were to happen, the rules are the rules. The points of interpretation are points of interpretation.
Okay, so
Makes
just
sense?
to be clear, we talked about good habits. Good habits is your quizzers should understand and know their pronouns and just specify them all the time, and just get good at that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that here
Yeah,
as we go through the next
yeah.
2 or 3 bullet points.
Go ahead. You keep.
Yeah. So the next point, in fact, the quizzer can replace the pronoun, which this is a recommendation that I make most of the time. Replace the pronoun with the antecedent or the thing to which the pronoun refers when answering. Or you can specify after the initial answer. For example, you can say, I called unto him referring to the Lord. That's one way to do it. Also, you can say, I called unto the Lord. Okay. This
As
is
long as it's not a quotation.
right. As long as it's not a quotation question. You can't do that in juniors. This is another difference, right? Because this that essence thing. We're understanding that him is the Lord, and instead of going through all those extra words, we're just throwing the word in there where the pronoun is, or the noun in there where the pronoun is.
And that is something that my kids developed as they got into the experience division. And we just, in practice, we just said, hey, beginning of the year, this year, guess what? We're going to just try in practice. We're going to try and just replace pronouns and non-quotation questions as we go. Just get in the habit of it. And it helps.
Because it
in a
does
lot
two
of ways.
things. It shortens their answer, right? The time that they have to be thinking about that during the answering. And then it also teaches them as they're learning the verses what the pronouns are. Helps with the content, with the context.
Absolutely.
So next bullet, the fourth one, if a question references a single verse, multiple verse, or is a chapter in which a pronoun is not identified, they do not have to specify that pronoun. We already said that.
But they can.
And we'll get to that down here in a minute. Would you quit jumping ahead? Next bullet, and this is huge. Get this, understand this. If the original question, and Philip talked to this a little bit earlier, in a quiz is not tied down to a verse and expects a certain pronoun to be specified. So in other words, if the question is asked in such a way that it does not give a verse reference, and the answer is looking to see if you know who one of the pronouns is, they will write questions and not put the verse reference on there simply to see if you know the pronoun in the verse. If that happens and you interrupt it and your quizzer finishes it and narrows it down, this is the one exception to the narrow it down thing, and narrows it down to a verse, they still have to identify that pronoun.
But narrowing it down doesn't make it wrong.
Narrowing it down doesn't make it wrong. Not identifying the pronoun makes it wrong.
Yeah. You can narrow it down to a verse, and that verse does not specify the pronoun. It specifies it in a different verse. And even though you narrow it down to that specific verse, as long as you clarify correctly, you're still correct.
Yeah,
Does
you
that make
still have to
sense?
identify the pronoun. And that trips a lot of people up, because even though it's essentially the same question, the whole intent of the question was to see if you knew who the pronoun was,
Right.
to see if you knew the him or the her or
Yeah.
and if you don't do that, you've not answered the intent of the question. Again, a huge difference from juniors to seniors. So narrowing it down, yes, you should do that all the time, in my opinion, but do it with the understanding that if there are pronouns in that verse that are essential to that answer, clarify them, because you don't know if your question narrowed it down or not, if his question narrowed it down or not.
Question online. What does essential to a correct answer mean? I've seen answers that didn't clarify a pronoun that were in the chapter. Okay, so the only time that a pronoun doesn't need to be specified if it's not specified within the scope of the question. So if the question is narrowed down to a specific verse, then and it's not specified.
Non-essential pronouns.
Then,
by
yes.
rule,
Okay.
don't
So
have to.
for instance, if let me think of a good example. If Jesus said unto, let Let me see. Let me think of a good one.
While you're thinking of a good one, this is a point for
Let me
me
think of an
to
example.
insert my
Well,
opinion.
I'm trying to think of a non-essential pronoun. A non-essential
Exactly.
pronoun would be
You're trying to think of one.
there's a pronoun in the verse, and a kid just quotes the verse, right? And he says a pronoun, and he didn't specify it. Well, was that pronoun or specification required to answer the question, or is it just extra correct information that you just quoted in your answer? But it's if Jesus. Jesus fed whom? And the answer is fed the multitude. And the verse says Jesus fed the multitude and said unto him, go your way. And you say Jesus fed them referring to the multitude, and said unto him, go your way. Well, that's a pronoun that you didn't specify, him. But guess what? It's not part of the answer. The question was Jesus fed whom? The multitude. You don't need to specify him, even if you said him in your answer, if that makes sense. Was I clear on that?
Yeah,
Okay.
and this to me is, if I could change one rule, this would be it. Simply because it's just a thing for me.
That's the rule you would change?
One of them, yeah.
Oh, no.
Because it is allowing for subjectivity. There's no, it by nature allows for the opinion of the quizmaster to dictate whether the question is correct or incorrect.
Oh, this might be an answer to your question though. When it's not, when pronouns are not needed to be specified, it's the next bullet point.
Yeah. If it's already in the question, next bullet point, if a pronoun is already identified in the question, or if it was previously identified in the answer, it does not need to be specified. That's not related to whether or not it's essential.
That answered the question? Okay. I think that was the answer to the
To
question.
that question specifically?
Yeah, their question was, it didn't need to be specified because it was in the answer.
Yeah.
Like the Lord, like referring to the Lord, what did he do? And you say, and he said unto them, You
It's
don't need to
already
specify
identified in the
he.
question.
It's been identified in the question.
Yeah. But I still don't necessarily, it's not my favorite, because to me, when you say if it's essential or not, the quizmaster gets to decide whether it's essential or not, which does not give the quizzer necessarily the opportunity to remove subjectivity from their answer. So anyway, that's just sorry, Brother Faubert, all those watching, I apologize, but that's just what I think. I'm sorry. So then we get to the last bullet. If a quizzer specifies a pronoun that is not necessary to specify, the quizzer will be counted correct as long as they correctly identify it, or better said, maybe don't incorrectly identify it.
Right. Even if there's a pronoun that isn't necessary to answer the question and you incorrectly specify it, it's wrong, because you're saying he referring to Moses. Well, actually, that's not Moses. It wasn't even necessary.
Because you proved that you don't know what the content is.
Right. Exactly. So basically, we could talk about pronouns a lot, and I know this can be a confusing subject. The big thing is we tried our best to explain it here. We have hopefully this is readable and understandable. It may take a little while to comprehend, and as you hear more questions and see things, it'll be more clear. Read the rule. If you still struggle with it, read the rule book. If you still struggle with it and you come to a question you're not sure, email me, email Darren.
Yeah.
It's worth the time it takes to figure this stuff out.
Email examples. If you come across an example and you're not sure whether or not it should be there or not, email it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just know, question writers aren't perfect. Like sometimes I'll leave out a pronoun specification that needs to be specified. So don't always just take me or other question writers as gospel. I mean,
Actually, that's
mistakes.
oftentimes where you can get a contest granted,
right?
Because that just kind of slips through the cracks sometimes.
Right. So just know the rules, and just because a question writer specifies this pronoun as this person, is that correct? That may be their interpretation, maybe they're incorrect. So it's important for us to make sure and to clarify. You had a question, Brother Larryville. Okay. Do you want to come read? Do you want to come say it in the microphone? No, you don't want to say it in the microphone. Okay. Okay. Doesn't want to be on camera. Okay. Last slide. What's that?
This actually came up at a tournament last year. That's fine.
Okay.
If there was a three-part,
If there was a three-part question,
the first part was asked,
the first part was completely asked,
and then the quizzer interrupted,
and then the quizzer interrupted,
and the quizzer asked the next two question parts,
and the quiz
not in the order they were.
And then the quizzer asked the next two question parts, not in the order that they were on the page.
But they answered in the order. If the quizzer answered in the order that they would.
But
That's
and,
their responsibility.
and the quizzer answered in the order that the quizzer asked.
Is that still correct?
Yes.
If you did not
Yes.
hold something.
Yes.
The quizzer needs to answer the question in the order that they made it. And does that make sense to everybody? So it's completely fine to flip things around in finishing of a question. 100%, that is fine. They are responsible to answer it in the order that of their question that they made, and that question needs to be in essence the same question as the question on the paper. Good.
And again, quizmasters aren't always perfect either. They can make mistakes on ruling on things like that.
Except
too.
for you. Yeah. All right. Did
Good
that
question.
answer your
He did probably correct.
Yeah. And
Yes.
Here's the-
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
There was a lot of.
There's a lot of debate
Confusion.
on that
Yeah.
specific
Yeah,
question.
A lot of people just started.
Right.
So that there's probably other ones.
Right.
Yeah, you're
Absolutely.
right.
I'm
Good
glad you brought
point.
that up. That was a really good
Thank you for
example.
bringing that up.
Very good example. Okay. Perfect.
Who
all
do
right.
we know that can talk about thinking like a question writer?
All right. So this is my 4th year writing questions, and I can't understate how it's changed me
Do
as
you
a
mean
coach.
overstate?
Oh, I can't overstate. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you, Darren. I can't
here for you, brother Philip.
overstate how much it has changed the way I think as a coach, the way I think about questions. The way, it completely changed the game for me. I'm not saying everybody needs to go be a question writer, but I can't say how much it helps to think like a question writer. Okay, because writing questions make me think like a question writer. If you can think like a question writer without writing questions, it can still be just as beneficial. This is a blurb. Anticipating, interrupting, and answering questions is no small part about getting in the head of the question writer. What better way for your quizzers to develop that skill than by writing questions themselves? Because the only thing that helps quizzers anticipation and interruption more than knowing the material inside and out and having previously heard the question is knowing the material inside and out and having written the same question themselves. Okay, that is really good. Okay, this is not saying, and there's nothing wrong with this, for actually truly making your kids sit down and write questions. There's nothing wrong with that. But what's better and more efficient in my mind is just when you're talking about, when you're quoting, pausing for a second, get them to come up with a question, or just get them in the mindset of seeing questions that can be made. And if they make that cross themselves, and like I was saying this earlier, if they made that cross in their mind, they made that connection, they made that good cross-reference question, there's nothing easier than answering a question that you already wrote yourself, right? I'm very good at answering my own questions that I wrote. Very good. Okay. And if quizzers write questions in their head, if they become and think like a question writer, that is super beneficial. And something Brother Faubert said to me, and I'll commend Camille Elliott, who they won nationals this past year, is after I think we came into Brother Faubert's session, or maybe we had lost to them in that quiz, and Brother Faubert just said, she's been in my head all day. That's literally what he said. Said she's been in my head all day, which means he wrote the questions and she literally was in the head of the question writer. She could just, she got enough of the question and she just knew where the questions were going. How did she do that? She had probably done so much of his questions to get used to the style, to get used to the tendencies, to get used to the patterns, and had thought through other potential. She had probably heard all these questions before,
in one form or another.
In one form or another. And so that is how you can take it to the next level as a quizzer interrupting. Quizzers need to be able to be given a verse reference and a question point value and be able to make a good question if the verse allows. Discussions stemming from kids doing this are vital and help coaches see possible errors in the way they process questions. This is huge. You need to be able to say, hey, give me a 3-part question on this verse. Say there's 3 who's in a verse. Guess what? Easy 3-part question. Make a question. Who. I call those owl questions. I love that one. It's a good one with the kids. It's a good owl question. Who. Okay. So you need to be able to see, you get your kids to make that, and say they said they do who, and then they make a what. Okay, then you're seeing, hey, your thought process is wrong on this. Do you notice that there's another who? And if you had these first two, you have your best chance.
Yeah,
It's gonna be the
again,
next
there's
who.
no such thing as a dead solid lock, but there's close.
Right.
It's about percentages.
But just being able to get kids to start creating their own questions, just challenge them. Hey, I do this with my 7-year-old. She hates it. I'm like, hey, give me a 2-part on this question. Just see if she, and then she tries. And then if I don't hear it come out of her mouth, I can't understand what's going on in her head. And if I don't understand what's going on in her head, I can't help her think. I can't teach her how to properly navigate this question because I don't know what's going on in her head. And that's why getting kids talking, and that was so beneficial about the kids that I was so blessed to coach, is they had no problem. They were very good at expressing their thought process. It's like, hey, what were you thinking? And that started when they were young. Hey, what were you thinking when you interrupted there? What were you thinking? Like, why did you finish it this way? And if they can explain to you why they made the decisions they can, and you understand why that's wrong, you can, as a coach, say, okay, but did you notice this? And maybe if you would notice this, do you see why it would have been a better guess to maybe go this way, a better question? And the only way we can do that is if we talk to our kids and figure that stuff out. Okay. Just because a quizzer interrupts and finishes with the wrong question doesn't mean that the question they made was bad, just different. There's a difference between you got it wrong and you got it wrong. Okay. So like I have no problem with my kid hitting in a spot that anticipating hitting at a good spot and making a good question if they get it wrong. Guess what? That was a good question you made. Guess what? The question writer wrote a different one. Okay. There's multiple ways that a 3-part can go on
I
this
feel
verse.
like Luke was phenomenal at that. Luke Barton was one of the quizzers that I had that I feel like, in fact, he was so good at it that he hurt himself many times because he trusted his ability to write the question, which often was a better question that was on the paper, but wasn't the question that was on the paper.
Right.
And so he tended to be a little overly aggressive on those type questions because he knew that he could write a great question, but it just doesn't necessarily always the same question.
Right. And sometimes, like I've heard, question writers say, yeah, like that. And I've said it. Yeah, he kind of made a better question than the one I wrote, but
it wasn't the one I
it
wrote.
wasn't the one I wrote.
Yeah.
And that's part of it.
Patience versus aggression.
All right. Different question writers. It is important to have the ability to adjust. We have, we're not going to hear state finals questions before state finals. We're not going to hear Brother Faubert's questions before state finals. So what can we do? We can train our kids to be adaptable to different questions. The only way to do that is to hear different question writers throughout the year. Go to tournaments with different question writers, buy different question writer sets. And then what do you notice about the questions? Are they straightforward? Do the quotations tend to start or end with the necessary info? What the point values? Do the point values give clues to the length and complexity? Does this question writer might like really short answers and not really have longer 10-point direct answers, but this question writer may have what I would say is that's kind of a 20-point length and he's putting it as a 10-pointer. Like question writers have the discretion to change things like length and complexity based on the point value. It's good to notice stuff like that as you're going through questions and teach your kids to notice stuff like that. Look for patterns and tendencies, verb, preposition, question words, etc. That's just breaking down questions, just noticing tendencies for question writers are different. I tell you, like Kim Faubert and Chad Nash, both great question writers. If you read me a Chad Nash quiz and you read me a Kim Faubert, I can tell you who wrote it.
By question 2.
By question 2.
There's
So
different styles. That's
and not to say
one's not
right,
good and one's not bad.
Yeah.
They're just different.
They're just different, and that's good. I mean, there's only if you wrote the one style, there's only so many questions we can write. It's good that we have question writers that have a different perspective on things because that just gives us, as long as they're consistent, it gives us more variety, more questions to work on throughout the year. Okay. Questions. Do question writers have to put a certain number of each type of question in a quiz? Is that your question? No. that is not a requirement. There is a standard that is like pretty much followed. Typically, what I found, and this is what I do, and not to say that everyone does this, but 5 10-point directs, 2 10.2 parts, 1 10-point quotation. That is pretty much standard. That is pretty much standard across the board. You get in the 20s, you got 2 directs, 2 parts, 2 multiples, and 2 quotations, and 1 cross-reference. That's 9 questions. So that's what I do. If I can't, and it's what I try to do is as much as I can. Sometimes, guess what? I run out of 2 parts in the 20s. Maybe I add another direct or another multiple, but just sometimes it can kind of be fudged this way or that way. And then in the 30s, typically you have at least one that's a cross-reference, at least one that's a direct or parts, and at least one that's some sort of quotation, whether that be a cross-reference quote or a direct quote.
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting to note is that these days, nobody writes a quiz. They write questions. They have software that formulate a quiz. So once you figure out what it is that person uses as their parameters, and Philip just explained to us his, it's probably going to be that same thing for that question writer all the way through, with exceptions
Right.
where they may have run out of a question or whatever, because
Yeah.
they're not physically going and manipulating, taking this question and putting it in this quiz.
I do.
It's soft, sometimes you do, but most of the time it's software driven. So again, it's not 100%, but it's a good sort of foundation to pull from. And where that really comes to be critical for me is when you get the 30-point questions, because you'll notice that certain types of quiz masters will use, for example, they'll put 1 direct in everywhere. Every time there's either going to be 1 direct or quotation, right? And at least 1 cross-reference in the 30 pointers, because you only got 3 questions. You want to kind of mix it up. Well, if you got the question 30 and you haven't had a cross-reference question, or 20 and you haven't had a cross-reference question yet, it's a pretty good opportunity, pretty good chance this is going to be a cross-reference question. And that's the kind of information I want to know. I can tell my quizzer in that timeout that I call right before question 20, hey, be ready. This is going to be a chart work question. Be ready for it.
We have a question from online. Oh, sure.
And this
I'm
is
sorry.
just, as we repeat that, the question online was for Philip to repeat how many of each type he puts in which question.
Sure.
And
I'm sorry
understand
about
that
that.
this is not everybody. This is just what you do.
this is what I do, and this is based on what I was just looking at nationals questions, state finals questions, BQE questions, and just it's not all the same all the time, but this is pretty much the standard. 5 10-point directs, 2 10.2 parts, 1 10-point quotation, 2 20-point directs, 2 20.2 parts. That's the one that's kind of fudgeable, the 2 parts in the multiples. 2 20-point multiples, which a multiple could be a 3, 4, 5, 6. I know a 2-part is a multiple as well, but for some, in the software actually, the question writing software actually differentiates 2 parts from multiples being 3 or more. So that's why in my head it's kind of how the software is laid out. So that's kind of how my brain interprets it too. 2 quotation 20-pointers and 1 cross-reference 20-pointer. And that cross-reference could be a cross-reference quotation, but it is a cross-reference.
And what about in the 30s?
The 30s, this is where I make sure I have a cross-reference and a quotation. And maybe like sometimes I'm okay with that being 1 question where I have a cross-reference quotation, and that's kind of the cross and the quote. But I want there to be a cross-reference, and I want them to have to quote something. But other than that, I'm not as strict. I know maybe some people are a little more particular.
And so again, thinking like a question writer, understanding what you just said, breaking it down as I go into a quiz. Now, I mean, I'm not trying to give away state secrets or anything, but if I know that, and I know that I need question 20, and we're sitting here on question 20, and this quiz written by Philip Melder has had neither a cross-reference or a quotation question in the 30s at all, I know what question 20 is.
Right. And, there is a little bit of an advantage to that, but at the same time, everyone's going to find out what the question type is before the question's read. So like it is something to be a little bit. And I know we like to take every little advantage we can, but we need to be ready for anything at the same time. You can't assume, because the last thing you want is them to be amped up and ready for the cross-reference 6, and then it's a quotation. And then, so at the same time, you want, you can't bank on anything, but it does give you.
And there's a whole lot of things to play into whether or not you would even tell your quizzers that, depending on the game situation, how they're quizzing, how the other team is quizzing, if you're wanting them to quiz aggressively, patient, all of that stuff plays into it. But it's one more little bit of information that you have at your disposal to use or not use as you see fit as a coach.
Right. Okay. Any more questions? Now we are about to dig into.
We are
actual
on the high
questions.
dive now.
Yeah.
We're going in.
Okay. Anything? Anybody? Nothing online? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. In 2007. Okay. Oh, the Bible here. Okay, he's referring to the Bible Heroes year. There's one question writer who had a quotation question that was on one verse, and it was worth 20 points. Another question had a quotation question on the same verse that was worth 30 points. So you can't bank on anything. That is 100% correct. So, I know I have been inconsistent myself with, like, I have written a 20-point quotation question, and the length
I've
is
actually called him and had this conversation.
yeah, and the length is this much, and then I did a verse that was actually shorter, and I made it a 30. Like, I have done my best this year. This year, actually writing, I have I use Excel a lot, like I said, in writing, and I know the number of characters in each verse, and I know it, like, I pretty much have it in, and I will fudge it a little bit if I need to, but over this many characters, I consider that a 30. Under this many characters, I consider that a 10. But that is me. That is me. And that is me trying to be.
We told
Yeah.
you. He told you he was a nerd.
That
This
is
should not be a
me
surprise.
trying to be consistent for myself. That is nothing. That is to say nothing about other question writers, but that is me trying to be consistent with my questions. Yes. What question writing software do I use? I use BQA, which is the it's called BQA. I don't remember. Bible Quizzing Assistant from Henry Brzezinski. Yes, I use that question writing software. Actually, so my process, I actually write in Excel, and I format them in Excel to just copy them directly into the text files that the software uses. It's just, I find it easier to write in Excel, just the way I am. If anyone wants to get into question writing and wants to learn, like, I'm completely open to sharing my process and how I write and what I use 100%. So, and that you can just email me if anyone's interested, but it's nerdy stuff. I'm just going to warn you now.
Anybody,
Okay.
any other
Oh,
questions?
you had something else, bro.
Okay.
If you're a coach and you are not a Bible quizzer yourself, it would be tremendous benefit to help your kids if you memorize at least some verses and you sit down on the quiz board and quiz against them. Yeah, 100%. Right. That absolutely. Have them ask you the questions. Yep. Right.
Mhm.
Right. Absolutely. We need to be able to empathize
Yeah,
with
that
our
goes to
kids.
empathy.
That
That's
goes
what
to
I'm saying.
empathy, which it helps a lot as a coach to understand how that feels. And I know, Brother Frost, were you a quizzer? No, you were not a quizzer. I quiz, and I never knew my stuff well enough to really be able to empathize with my kids that really did know their stuff. But no, you're
probably know the
100%
material
right.
better now as a coach than you did as a quiz.
Hey, and there is nothing wrong with memorizing scripture as a coach.
There's nothing wrong with memorizing
it.
scripture ever.
Right. You're correct. It's Brother Frost. What was awful was him to empathize.
M90.
There's
is what he's
a
referring
program
to,
called
right?
M90.
And that's a great program for everyone, specifically coaches.
Right. So at their church, they decided as a coach, all the coaches at their church would do M90 together 1 year to kind of be able to empathize and go through with it. I think that's fantastic.
Me
I
too.
think that's wonderful. Very helpful. Awesome. So what did you learn from do you want to say something? You want to speak to it? Yeah. Come on down.
So I was just saying, in terms of M90,
There you go.
what we did was myself and another coach learn the verses, but then, yeah, you quiz against the quizzers. And of course, they know many more verses than that, but still helpful to be able to write your own questions along with the material, understand interruptions a lot better. And thankfully, most of our coaches have quizzed, and I think that's probably the best path. But for those of us who really didn't know anything about this until a handful of years ago, it's a great way to introduce yourself and kind of get more immersed in it.
Amen. Agreed.
I think it would be fantastic as a district if we had a coaches M90 tournament just to like, first of all, I would love to whip you at the quiz board.
Well, first of all, that wouldn't happen. Second of all, there is an Overhill tournament that happens in Texas every year.
it's in Texas.
Plug
though.
for Jimmy Votaw and his
yeah.
Over the Hill tournament. Wisconsin also does on many years that